Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Today, the seas begin to churn, and the wind howls through the ancient cedars. We are walking the untamed, turbulent path of the storm god, Susanoo. Close your eyes, settle in, and let the wild winds blow. In the earliest mists of the unformed world, long before the archipelago of Japan had fully coalesced from the briny silence of the primordial sea, the cosmos was a place of fluid boundaries and shifting energies. The heavy elements had not yet fully settled to form the earth, and the lighter elements were still drifting upward to solidify the high plane of heaven, or Takamagahara. It is here, in this ancient, trembling silence, that the seeds of the most turbulent deity in the Shinto pantheon were sown, not through a union of flesh, but through a ritual of profound purification. To understand the storm, one must first understand the calm that preceded it, and the tragedy that necessitated its birth. The great creator god, Izanagi-no-Mikoto, he who invites, stood alone on the shores of Ahukihara in Tachibana. The air here was cool, carrying the scent of salt and pine, a stark contrast to the suffocating rot and sulfur of the underworld from which he had just fled. He had ventured into Yomi-no-Kuni, the land of the dead, to retrieve his beloved wife, Izanami. But that journey had ended in horror, with him fleeing from her decaying form and the hags of thunder that pursued him. Now, standing under the open sky, Izanagi was a being polluted by death, his divine essence clouded by the impurities of the grave. The sun had not yet risen in its full glory. The world was bathed in a gray pre-dawn twilight. The sound of the waves lapping against the stones of the river mouth was rhythmic, hypnotic, a natural metronome counting down the moments until a new age of gods would begin. Izanagi began to disrobe, casting aside the garments stained by the underworld. His staff, his sash, his upper garment, his trousers, as each item touched the ground, new deities sprang into existence, born from the residual power clinging to his clothes. But these were minor spirits, echoes of his journey. The true power lay within his own body, waiting to be released through the act of misogi, the ritual washing. He stepped into the water. It was cold, biting against his skin, a physical shock that mirrored the spiritual cleansing he sought. He dove into the middle stream, avoiding the stagnant waters of the shallows and the violent rapids of the deep. He washed his left eye, scrubbing away the visions of the rotting underworld. From this act, a brilliant light exploded forth, Amaterasu Omikami, the great heaven, illuminating deity, the Sun Goddess. Her radiance was so blinding, so warm and encompassing, that the gray twilight shattered instantly, replaced by the golden promise of day. She ascended immediately, her presence commanding the sky. Then Izanagi washed his right eye. The light that emerged was cooler, silver, and serene. This was Tsukuyomi-no-Mikoto, the moon-reading deity. He carried with him the quiet dignity of the night, a silent observer to balance the exuberance of the sun. The cosmos was now lit by two great beacons, a duality of day and night, heat and cold. But the ritual was not finished. There remained a heaviness in Izanagi, a lingering turbulence that had not been washed away by the birth of light. It was a raw, chaotic energy, sitting deep within his respiratory passages, the very breath of life that had been tainted by the stagnant air of death. Izanagi took up the water in his cupped hands and brought it to his nose. He inhaled the purity of the river and exhaled the impurity of the grave. He scrubbed his nose, the bridge between the inner body and the outer world. And from this final, violent expurgation, he was born, Takahaya Susanoo-no-Mikoto. His name would come to echo through the ages, whispered in fear during typhoons and shouted in triumph during festivals. Susanoo, the impetuous male, the swift, violent deity. Unlike his siblings, Susanoo did not ascend immediately to the sky in a blaze of silent light. His birth was accompanied by a sound, a rush of wind, a sudden drop in pressure, the smell of ozone and rain. He emerged dripping, not just with the river water, but with a latent power that felt dangerous, unpredictable. While Amaterasu was the order of the rising sun, and Tsukuyomi was the order of the rhythmic tides, Susanoo was the chaos of the storm. He was the force that uproots trees, the wave that crashes against the cliff, the wind that howls through the mountain passes. Izanagi looked upon his 3 noble children, the Mihashira no Uzu no Miko, and felt a swell of pride that momentarily eclipsed his exhaustion. These were the illustrious offspring he had been waiting for, the culmination of his creative endeavors. He removed the necklace of jewels, the Mikuratana no Kami, from his neck, beads that clicked together with the sound of settling stones, and bestowed them upon Amaterasu. "You," Izanagi commanded, his voice resonating with the authority of creation, "shall rule the plane of high heaven, Takamagahara. You shall be the light that guides the myriad spirits." He turned to Tsukuyomi, the silent silver child. "And you," he said, "shall be the ruler of the night, the dominion of the moon. You shall govern the tides and the passage of time in the dark." Finally, his gaze fell upon Susanoo. The young god stood differently from his siblings. He did not float with ethereal grace. He stood with his feet planted firmly, his chest heaving, his eyes already filled with a tempestuous emotion that defied easy categorization. He looked wild, his hair unkempt, his limbs thick with the potential for violence and strength. "And you, Susanoo," Izanagi proclaimed, perhaps sensing that this child needed a domain as vast and restless as his own spirit. "You shall rule the sea plane. You shall govern the oceans, the storms, and the vast blue expanse that surrounds the islands." It was a gift of immense power. The ocean was the lifeblood of the world, the source of food, the pathway between lands. To rule the sea was to hold the fate of the emerging world in one's hands. Amaterasu accepted her mandate with grace. Tsukuyomi accepted his with silence. But Susanoo did not move. He did not bow. He did not ascend to his throne of waves. He simply stood there, the water of the river drying on his skin, a frown etching itself onto his face, a face that would soon become famous for its capacity to express the deepest, most destructive sorrow the world had ever known. This moment, this pause on the riverbank, was the first sign of the trouble that would come. It was the first crack in the divine order. The universe had been divided into heaven, night, and sea. But the sea refused to be tame. The storm god had been born, but he had not yet accepted his name or his purpose. He was a force of nature, trapped in a divine form, and the constraints of a ruler felt to him not like a crown, but like a cage. Time in the age of the gods flows differently than the time of mortals. It is measured not in hours or days, but in cycles of growth and decay, in the shifting of stars and the erosion of mountains. Following the distribution of the three realms, a period of peace should have descended upon the cosmos. Amaterasu took her place in the sun, shining benevolently upon the reed plains. Tsukuyomi counted the phases of the moon. But on the surface of the earth and upon the face of the deep, there was no peace. There was only a sound. A low, mournful, terrifying sound that never ceased. It was the sound of weeping. Susanoo-no-Mikoto, the ruler of the seas, had not taken up his trident or his scepter. He had not built a palace of coral or commanded the tides to obey him. Instead, he had let his hair grow long and wild, uncombed and unwashed, until it hung down past his waist like tangles of seaweed. His beard, the mark of his virility and power, grew long and matted, reaching down to the center of his chest, soaked perpetually with tears. He wept. This was not the quiet crying of a child who has scraped a knee, nor the dignified mourning of a lover. This was a cosmic wailing, a physical rejection of reality that shook the foundations of the world. The Kojiki, that ancient record of matters, tells us that his weeping was so intense, so filled with raw, elemental grief, that it drained the moisture from the world itself. His weeping was such, the ancient texts say, that the green mountains withered into bare, brown hills, and the rivers and seas dried up entirely. Imagine the scene: the lush, primordial forests that had begun to cover the islands of Japan, trees that had stood since the separation of heaven and earth, began to turn brittle, their leaves curled and browned, falling in dry cascades. The sap within their trunks evaporated, drawn out by the sympathetic magic of the god's sorrow. The rivers, those vibrant arteries of the land, stopped flowing. Their beds turned to cracked mud, then to dust. The fish gasped and died. The spirits of the water fled into the ether, terrified by the vacuum created by their master's grief. The sound of his wailing was like a constant gale. It howled through the valleys known as the Aoyama, green mountains, stripping them of their vitality. It was a sorrow that killed. And in the wake of this ecological devastation, a different kind of darkness began to stir. The drying of the land and the disruption of the natural order weakened the barriers that held back malevolent spirits. The sound of bad deities was like the buzzing of summer flies, millions of minor wicked kami emerging from the shadows, empowered by the chaos Susanoo was creating. They swarmed over the withered land, causing portents of woe to occur everywhere. Disease, famine, and unease spread among the nascent spirits of the earth. Finally, Izanagi could ignore this no longer. He had retired, intending to rest after his labors of creation, but the devastation wrought by his youngest son forced him to intervene. He descended to where Susanoo sat, surrounded by the desolation he had caused, his eyes red and swollen, his beard wet with the tears that had stolen the world's water. Susanoo, Izanagi's voice was like the cracking of stone, deep and stern. I entrusted you with the ruling of the sea plain. It is a vast and noble charge. Why do you not rule the domain I gave you? Why do you do nothing but weep and wail, destroying the land and drying up the rivers? What is the cause of this?" Susanoo looked up. His face was a mask of tragic beauty and terrifying power. He did not fear his father. His grief was too all-consuming to leave room for fear. "I weep," Susanoo answered, his voice thick with the sobs that had shaken the mountains, "because I do not wish to rule this land you have given me." Izanagi paused, his divine brow furrowing. "Then what is it you desire?" "I wish to go to my mother's land," Susanoo declared. The words hung heavy in the dry air. "I wish to go to Ne-no-Katasu-Kuni, the land of roots, the distant Underworld." This confession struck Izanagi with the force of a physical blow. Ne-no-Katasu-Kuni was often associated with Yomi, the very place Izanagi had fled from in terror. It was the realm of Izanami, the mother Susanoo had never known, for her death had preceded his birth. He was born from the washing of the nose, from the residue of Izanagi's return. He was, in a sense, a child of the boundary between life and death. It was a profound, instinctual yearning. He felt no connection to the bright, sterile order of heaven or the rhythmic tides of the surface sea. He longed for the dark, damp, fertile depth of the earth, the place of origins, the womb of the mother he missed with a visceral ache. But to Izanagi, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had just cleansed himself of that place. He had established the order of the living world to escape the pull of the dead. And now, his own son, the storm god, was rejecting the gift of the living ocean to chase the shadow of the dead mother. Izanagi's patience, worn thin by his own trauma and the destruction of the land, snapped. The creator god who had birthed the islands and the gods flew into a rage. "If that is your heart," Izanagi roared, his voice shaking the remaining leaves from the withered trees, "then you shall not dwell in this land. If you reject the ocean, if you reject the order I have made, then be gone." It was a divine expulsion. Kamuyarai. "I banish you," Izanagi proclaimed. "You shall not live in the ocean domain. You are cast out." With that final decree, the relationship between father and son was severed. Izanagi, his duty done and his disappointment absolute, turned his back on the world he had made. The texts say he retired to the child-dwelling palace in Taga, or perhaps Awaji, withdrawing from the affairs of his children. He left the stage of mythology, leaving the three noble children to shape the fate of the cosmos. Susanoo stood alone in the ruin he had made. He had been granted his wish, in a way. He was no longer bound to the sea, but he was now an exile, a god without a home, a king without a kingdom. The rejection stung, but it also liberated him. The wildness in his heart, which had manifested as grief, now began to curdle into something more volatile. A desperate need to be understood, mixed with a reckless, destructive defiance. He wiped the tears from his eyes. The weeping stopped, but the storm did not end. It merely changed direction. "If I am to leave," Susanoo muttered to the wind, his voice gaining a hard, metallic edge. "If I am to go to the land of roots, I will first ascend to the high plane of heaven. I will speak to my sister, Amaterasu. I will take my leave of her." It seemed like a brotherly gesture, a final farewell. But Susanoo was the god of storms. He did not know how to do anything quietly. As he turned his gaze upward toward Takamagahara, the energy he summoned for his ascent was not the gentle drift of a cloud. It was an eruption. He planted his feet and leapt. The force of his movement was cataclysmic. As he ascended, the mountains and rivers that he had withered now shook violently. The land quaked and groaned under the pressure of his passing. The very architecture of the cosmos rattled. In the high plane of heaven, Amaterasu sat upon her throne, basking in the peace of her rule. Suddenly, the floor of heaven trembled. The golden halls vibrated. A low roar, like the approach of 1,000 typhoons, reached her divine ears. She stood up, her eyes narrowing, her light flaring with sudden intensity. She knew that sound. It was her brother. He does not come with good intentions, Amaterasu whispered to herself, her hand instinctively reaching for the jewels at her neck. This is not the approach of a pilgrim. This is the approach of an invader. He has been banished by our father, and now he comes to seize my land. He comes to take the high plane of heaven for himself. The Sun Goddess did not cower. She did not flee. If the storm was coming to conquer the sun, he would find that the light could be as sharp as any blade. She began to prepare for war. The ascent of Susanoo was a spectacle of raw kinetic energy. In the Kojiki, the description is visceral. The mountains and rivers all shook, and every land quaked. This was not merely a journey, it was an upheaval. He was climbing the Ame-no-Mihashira, the pillar of heaven, or perhaps scaling the invisible currents of the air itself. But his heavy, sodden spirit, burdened with the rejection of his father and the longing for his mother, dragged against the ether, creating shockwaves. To the minor gods of heaven, the approach of Susanoo must have felt like the end of the world. The serene blue sky began to darken with bruising purple clouds. Lightning, usually reserved for the lower atmosphere, began to lick at the foundations of the heavenly palaces. The air grew thick and humid, charged with static that made the hairs on the arms of the gods stand on end. Amaterasu Omikami, however, was not a minor god. She was the ruler of the universe, the supreme authority. Yet, she felt a flicker of genuine alarm. Susanoo's reputation preceded him. He was the weeping god, the witherer of mountains. If he could destroy the earth simply by crying, what could he do to heaven if he came in anger? "He has surely come to snatch away my land," she concluded, her divine intuition interpreting the violence of his approach as an act of aggression. "He thinks that because our father has cast him out, he can simply take my inheritance." Amaterasu's transformation in this moment is one of the most striking images in all of Japanese mythology. We often think of the Sun Goddess as a benevolent, motherly figure, a weaver of garments and a planter of rice. But here she revealed the martial aspect of the sun, the scorching, blinding power that can dominate the battlefield. She loosened her hair. The elegant, looped hairstyle of a noble lady was undone. She separated her long black tresses and twisted them into a different style. The Mizura style, bunches of hair tied over the ears, a hairstyle worn exclusively by men and warriors of that era. This was a visual declaration. She was setting aside her gendered role as a passive sister and assuming the mantle of a warrior prince. Next, she looked to her adornments. She took the long strings of magatama beads, the curved jewels that represented soul and authority, and wound them around her hair, her wrists, and her ankles. In the context of the myth, these were not just jewelry. They were talismans of immense power, spiritual batteries charged with the essence of authority. Specifically, she wound the august string of 500 Yasaka jewels in the left and right bunches of her hair and on her left and right arms. Then came the weaponry. She summoned a high-capacity quiver, one capable of holding 1,000 arrows, and slung it over her back. She added another quiver, one for 500 arrows, to her side. She took up a massive bow, the kind that required divine strength to draw, and finally she strapped on a heavy pad or arm guard to protect her forearm from the snap of the bowstring, a piece of equipment that signaled she was ready to fire not once, but hundreds of times. She stepped out to the edge of the high plain of heaven, to the bank of the Ame no Yasukawa, the heavenly, tranquil river. But she did not stand politely. The texts describe her stamping her feet into the ground with such force that she sank into the earth up to her thighs. She kicked the earth until it hardened like stone, creating a fortification out of the very ground beneath her. She stood there, half buried in the bedrock of heaven, an immovable object waiting for the irresistible force. She let out a katsu, a mighty shout of defiance. "Why do you ascend here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind Susanoo was generating. Susanoo finally crested the horizon of heaven. He saw his sister, not as the gentle weaver he might have expected, but as a terrified and terrifying warrior, bristling with arrows, her hair tied back for war, standing in a crater she had kicked into existence. He stopped. The wind died down slightly, though the clouds remained swirling around him. He looked at her, and perhaps for the first time he realized the magnitude of the misunderstanding his chaotic nature engendered. He had not come to conquer. He had come to say goodbye. But he was a being of such intensity that his hello looked like an invasion. "My intentions are not evil," Susanoo shouted back, holding his empty hands out to show he carried no weapon, though his very presence was a weapon. "It is only that the great deity, our Father, has inquired into the matter of my weeping. I told him I wished to go to my mother's land, and he banished me with a divine expulsion. As I am about to depart for the land of roots, I thought only to come and take leave of you, my sister. I have no other intent. Why do you look so fierce? Why do you arm yourself against your brother?" Amaterasu did not lower her bow. The sun does not trust the storm easily. Words were wind, and Susanoo was the master of wind. He could be lying. He was a trickster, a wild card. "If your heart is truly pure," Amaterasu challenged, her eyes flashing like solar flares, "how will you prove it? How can I know that your intentions are red and bright, and not black and deceitful?" Red and bright, ake-ki, was the ancient term for purity and sincerity, while black signified pollution and evil. Amaterasu was demanding a trial, a metaphysical test that would reveal the true color of his soul. Susanoo smiled. It was a dangerous, confident smile. He knew he was innocent of the desire to usurp her throne, at least for now. He was confident in his own chaotic integrity. "Let us swear an oath," Susanoo proposed. "Let us perform ukehi." Ukehi was a solemn, ancient ritual of divination. It was a trial by pledge. The gods would produce children from their own possessions. The nature, gender, or quality of these children would serve as the verdict. It was a way of asking the cosmos itself to judge the truth of their hearts. "We shall produce children," Susanoo said, "and by the children we produce, my heart shall be known." Amaterasu nodded slowly. She stepped up from the hole she had kicked in the earth. The tension did not vanish, but it shifted from the immediate threat of physical combat to the ritualized tension of a magical duel. They stood on opposite banks of the heavenly, tranquil river, the water flowing silently between them. The air was thick with power. The Sun Goddess on one side, dazzling and armored. The Storm God on the other, wild-haired and smelling of rain. "Begin," Amaterasu commanded. Susanoo unbuckled the sword he wore at his waist, the 10-span sword, Totsuka-no-Tsurugi. He held it out. It was a magnificent blade, shimmering with divine sharpness. He presented it to her across the river. "Give me your sword," Amaterasu said. She took his sword, and then, in a display of divine transmutation that defies mortal logic, she broke the sword into 3 pieces. She put the pieces of the metal blade into her mouth. She chewed them. The sound of the goddess grinding divine steel between her teeth echoed over the river. She crunched the sword into a fine mist, mixing it with her divine saliva, her breath, and her essence. Then she exhaled. She blew the mist out in a soft, glittering cloud. From the mist of Susanoo's sword, 3 deities materialized. They were beautiful, elegant, serene figures. The first was Takiri Baime, Princess of the Mist. The second was Ichikishima Hime, Princess of the Islands. The third was Tagitsu Hime, Princess of the Torrent. 3 goddesses, gentle, graceful, and clearly female. Amaterasu looked at them. "These are women," she noted. Now it was Susanoo's turn. He looked at Amaterasu. "Give me your jewels," he said. Amaterasu unwound the long strings of Magatama beads from her hair and arms, the august string of 500 Yasaka jewels. She handed them across the river to Susanoo. Susanoo took the jewels, the symbols of the sun's authority. He tossed them into his mouth. He chewed them with a loud, crunching rhythm, grinding the jade and agate into dust. He swirled the mixture in his mouth, infusing it with the storm power of his breath. He exhaled. From the mist of Amaterasu's jewels, 5 deities sprang forth. The first was Ame-no-Oshihomimi, the ruling rice ear of heaven. The second was Ame-no-Hohi. The third was Amatsu-hikone. The fourth was Ikutsu-hikona. The fifth was Kumanoku-subi. 5 male deities, strong, potent, and clearly masculine. The ritual was complete. 8 children stood on the banks of the heavenly, tranquil river. 3 women born from the sword, 5 men born from the jewels. Now came the interpretation. In the logic of Ukehi, the outcome depends on the pre-agreed conditions, which the myths often leave ambiguous until the moment of declaration. Amaterasu spoke first. "The 5 male deities were born from my jewels," she declared. "Therefore, they are my children. The 3 female deities were born from your sword. Therefore, they are your children." Susanoo looked at his 3 daughters. They were delicate, pure, and graceful. In the ancient symbolic language of Japan, females were often associated with gentleness and tranquility. In this specific context, while males were associated with turbulence. Or perhaps, more simply, Susanoo had claimed that if his intentions were pure, he would produce females, gentleness, or perhaps simply that the quality of the children proved his innocence. In the Kojiki, Susanoo interprets the result immediately and loudly. "My heart is bright and pure," he roared, throwing his arms up in triumph. "Because my intentions were clean, I have begotten gentle, delicate maidens. The sword was mine, and the sword produced grace. I have won. I have won." Amaterasu did not argue. The logic seemed to hold. If he had come to conquer, his sword, the instrument of war, would have surely produced violent warrior sons. Instead, it had produced the goddesses of the sea mist, who would later become the guardians of the Munakata shrines. This proved the sword was not drawn for war. "You have won," Amaterasu conceded, lowering her bow. Susanoo had been vindicated. He had proved to the universe and to the sun that he was not a usurper. He was just a brother coming to say goodbye. But there is a danger in victory, especially for a personality like Susanoo. Relief is a calm emotion. Triumph is a volatile one. As the adrenaline of the trial flooded his system, the impetuous male did not settle down. He did not say, "Thank you, sister," and leave for the underworld. No, the validation intoxicated him. The storm god felt a surge of manic energy. He had been accused, and he had been cleared. He felt invincible. And an invincible storm god is a recipe for disaster. "I have won," he shouted again, his eyes darting around the pristine, orderly fields of heaven. "And now I will celebrate." The celebration of Susanoo would prove to be far more dangerous than his anger ever was. Victory, for a deity of chaos, does not look like a banquet or a song. It looks like unbridled release. Susanoo had suppressed his nature to pass the trial. He had stood still, followed the rules of ukehi, and chewed the jewels politely. Now the restraint snapped. "I have won," Susanoo bellowed, his voice cracking with a manic edge. "The Sun Goddess admits my purity. The heavens admit my innocence." He began to run. He did not run on the paths. He ran through the cultivation fields. Amaterasu, being the responsible ruler, maintained vast rice paddies in heaven to feed the gods and set the example for agriculture. She had the Yaiden, imperial rice fields, and the Odin, great rice fields. It was spring, the season of planting. The dikes, the small earthen walls that hold the water in the paddies, had just been built. The irrigation ditches had just been dug. It was a delicate, precise system of hydraulic engineering. Susanoo looked at these orderly lines, these perfect squares of water and mud, and he felt a compulsion to disrupt them. It was the urge of the hurricane to flatten the crop. He stomped through the fields. He kicked down the divisions between the rice paddies, breaking the dikes. The water flooded out, ruining the irrigation levels. He filled in the ditches that carried the life-giving water. It was an act of agricultural vandalism, striking at the very heart of civilization's food source. "See, my power," he laughed, muddying the sacred waters. Amaterasu watched this from afar. Surprisingly, she did not strike him down. Perhaps she felt guilty for suspecting him earlier. Perhaps she was trying to be the tolerant older sister. "Ah," Amaterasu said to her attendants, forcing a smile. "My elder brother is enthusiastic. He is not destroying the dikes. He is merely breaking down the divisions because he thinks the land needs to be reimagined. He is filling the ditches because he wants the water to flow freely." She made excuses for him. She tried to interpret his chaos as misunderstood benevolence. Emboldened by her lack of punishment, Susanoo's rampage escalated. He waited until the autumn, the time of the Niname-sai, the festival of tasting the first fruits. This was the most sacred ritual of the year, where the emperor, or in this case, the sun goddess, communed with the spirits of the harvest. Amaterasu had built a special hall, the Great Tasting Palace, for this purpose. Susanoo snuck into the hall the night before the ceremony. And there, in the sacred sanctuary where the holy rice was to be eaten, he defecated. He left a pile of divine excrement right under the seat of the goddess. When Amaterasu entered the hall the next morning, the stench was overpowering, but still she refused to condemn him. "My brother," she said, her voice straining with diplomacy, "has been drinking. He must have vomited. Yes, this is not filth. It is merely something he spat up in his drunken joy. He means no harm." It was a staggering display of denial, but Susanoo took this denial as permission. If breaking the fields wasn't enough, if defiling the temple wasn't enough, he needed to do something so shocking, so absolutely taboo, that it could not be ignored. He looked for the most sacred, peaceful place in all of heaven. He found the Imabata, the sacred weaving hall. Inside, Amaterasu sat with her weaving maidens. They were weaving the nigitai, soft garments, for the gods. It was a scene of perfect domestic tranquility, the rhythmic clack-clack of the loom, the soft murmur of the women. Susanoo went to the pastures of heaven. He found the Ame-no-Fuchikoma, the heavenly piebald horse. The horse was a sacred animal, beloved by the gods. Susanoo grabbed the beast, and then, in an act of grotesque violence, he flayed it. But he did not flay it normally, from the neck down. He flayed it backwards, from the tail up to the head, a backward flaying, sakahagi, that was considered a ritual abomination, maximizing the pain and the spiritual pollution. With the bloody, skinless carcass of the horse in his hands, Susanoo climbed onto the roof of the weaving hall. He found the ventilation hole in the roof. Below, the women were weaving. The atmosphere was silent and holy. Susanoo smashed a hole through the tiles and hurled the flayed horse down into the room. The bloody mass of flesh and bone slammed into the center of the weaving circle. Blood splattered across the pristine divine garments. The smell of copper and raw meat filled the air instantly. The weaving maidens screamed. Chaos erupted. In the panic, one of the weaving maidens, some texts say it was Wakas Hirume, a younger aspect of the sun goddess herself, was so startled that she fell against her loom. The sharp weaving shuttle stabbed into her genitals, or her body, depending on the translation. She died instantly from the shock and the wound. Blood, death, defilement of the sacred hall, disruption of the food supply, desecration of the ritual space. Susanoo had committed the heavenly sins. Amatsu Tsumi. He had crossed every line. Amaterasu stood amidst the ruin of her weaving hall, looking at the dead maiden and the flayed horse. The excuses died in her throat. The tolerance evaporated. She was not angry. She was terrified and heartbroken. The world was not safe. Her brother was not a harmless trickster. He was a monster. She did not fight him. She did not shout. She simply turned away. Amaterasu fled. She ran to the Ama-no-Iwato, the heavenly rock cave. She slipped inside the dark cavern, and she pulled the massive rock door shut. The sound of the rock sealing the cave was the sound of hope dying. As the sun goddess vanished, the light of the world vanished with her. Takamagahara was plunged into darkness. The central land of reed plains, the earth, was plunged into darkness. It was not just night. It was an eternal, suffocating blackness. The alternation of day and night ceased. In the sudden cold dark, the voices of the evil spirits rose again. The text says, "The voices of the myriad evil deities were like unto the buzzing of flies, and all manner of calamities arose." Susanoo stood on the roof of the weaving hall, panting, his hands stained with the blood of the horse. He looked out at the world he had just plunged into eternal night. He had won the trial, yes, but in his celebration, he had broken the universe. The storm god had finally gotten the attention he craved, but the cost was the light of the world. The ceiling of the Ama-no-Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, marked the darkest moment in the history of the cosmos. When Amaterasu Omikami shut herself away, she did not merely remove a source of illumination. She withdrew the organizing principle of reality. Without the sun, the distinction between day and night collapsed into a single, suffocating Tokayami, the eternal night. It was a darkness that had weight. It pressed against the skin of the gods and the mortals alike. In the Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven, the celestial palaces lost their glimmer. The rice fields, which Susanoo had so recently vandalized, froze over in the sudden, absolute cold. But the physical darkness was secondary to the spiritual chaos that ensued. The Kojiki describes this era with a chilling auditory detail. The voices of the myriad evil deities were like unto the buzzing of flies in the fifth moon. Imagine the sound of a billion insects, a droning, agitated hum that filled every corner of the universe. These were the Araburu Kami, the unruly spirits and malevolent forces that had been kept in check by the light of the sun. Now, emboldened by the shadow, they rose from the rocks and the roots. Calamities struck everywhere. Crops failed instantly. Pestilence spread like a fog. The order of the universe, so carefully established by Izanagi, was unraveling at the seams. The 800 myriad deities, Yaoyorozu no Kami, were thrown into a panic. They gathered on the banks of the Ame no Yasukawa, the heavenly tranquil river, the very spot where Susanoo and Amaterasu had performed their trial. But the tranquility was gone. The dry riverbed was crowded with gods arguing, weeping, and shouting, their divine faces illuminated only by the faint cold light of the stars. They needed a plan. Force would not work. The rock door was sealed by the will of the supreme goddess, and no physical strength could pry it open against her wish. They needed wisdom, and so they turned to Omoikane no Kami, the deity of thought combining. He was the strategist of heaven, a god whose intellect was so vast it was said to encompass the thoughts of many. Omoikane stood amidst the clamor, his mind calm. He understood that Amaterasu had retreated, not just out of fear, but out of sorrow and a sense of violation caused by Susanoo's sacrilege. To bring her back, they could not plead or threaten. They had to pique her curiosity. They had to stage a festival so raucous, so intriguing, that even a grieving sun could not resist peeking out. The plan Omoikane devised was elaborate, a masterpiece of ritual theater that would become the prototype for all Shinto festivals, Matsuri, to follow. First, they needed to create a new dawn, even if an artificial one. They gathered the long-singing birds of the eternal land, Tokoyo no Naganaki Dori, the roosters. These birds were the heralds of the sun. The gods set up perches for them, hoping their crowing would trick the sun goddess into thinking morning had come without her, or at least remind her of her duty. Next, they needed sacred objects to lure her spirit. They summoned the blacksmith deity, Amatsumara, and the stone-cutter goddess, Ishikuridome. From the heavenly metal mountains, they took hard iron. They worked in the darkness, the sparks from their forge the only light in the gloom. They crafted the Yata-no-Kagami, the 8-span mirror. It was a bronze disc of perfect clarity, polished until it shimmered like a trapped star. This mirror would be crucial. It was intended to capture the image of the goddess and reflect her own radiance back at her, a trap of vanity and light. Then they summoned Tama-no-Oya, the jewel ancestor. He crafted the Yasakani no Magatama, the curved jewels of stringing beads. These green stones represented the soul, the deep life force that Susanoo's withered earth so desperately lacked. They uprooted a massive sakaki tree, Cleyera japonica, the sacred evergreen, pulling it from the heavenly Mount Kagu with its roots still attached. This tree would serve as the himorogi, the conduit for the divine presence. On its upper branches they hung the string of jewels. On the middle branches they hung the great mirror. On the lower branches they hung offerings of blue and white cloth, woven from the fibers of paper mulberry and hemp. The stage was set. Futodama-no-Mikoto and Ame-no-Koyan-no-Mikoto, the ancestors of the priestly clans, stood ready to recite the liturgies. Ame-no-Tajikarao, the heavenly hand-strength male, a god of immense physical power, hid himself in the shadows beside the cave entrance, his muscles coiled, waiting for the single moment of opportunity. But a stage needs a performer, and for this, the gods chose the most uninhibited, vibrant, and shamanic of them all, Ame-no-Uzume-no-Mikoto. Ame-no-Uzume was the goddess of dawn, of mirth, and of revelry, while Amaterasu was the dignified imperial aspect of the light. Uzume was the primal, energetic spark of life. She did not wear armor. She bound up her sleeves with a cord of creeping club moss from the heavenly Mount Kagu. She tied a headband of leaves around her forehead. She held a bundle of bamboo leaves in her hands to serve as a rhythmic shaker. She overturned a wooden tub outside the cave entrance. This hollow vessel would be her drum, her stage, and the instrument of resonance. In the suffocating silence of the eternal night, Uzume leaped onto the overturned tub. Thump, thump. The sound of her feet striking the wood echoed like a heartbeat. She began to dance. This was not a polite court dance. It was kagura, god entertainment, in its rawest form. She stomped her feet, entering a shamanic trance kamigakari. She channeled the energy of the earth, the suppressed vitality of the gods. As the rhythm intensified, Uzume let go of all propriety. She exposed her breasts. She pushed her skirt down to her waistband, revealing her genitals. It was an act of radical, sacred absurdity. It was a display of life, sex, and fertility in the face of death and darkness. It was a rejection of the shame that had driven Amaterasu into the cave. The reaction of the 800 myriad gods was immediate. The tension broke. A roar of laughter erupted from the assembly. It was a belly-shaking, earth-rumbling laughter that shook the high plane of heaven. The high plane of heaven shook, and the 800 myriad deities laughed together, the text says. Inside the cave, sitting in the absolute dark, Amaterasu heard the noise. She was baffled. She had expected the world to be weeping in her absence. She had expected the gods to be mourning the loss of the sun. Instead, she heard roosters crowing as if it were dawn. She heard the rhythmic stomping of a dance, and above all, she heard the joyous, raucous laughter of the entire pantheon. Why? Amaterasu wondered. Why do they laugh when the world is dead? Her curiosity, just as Omoikane had predicted, overpowered her resolve. She approached the massive rock door. She pushed it open just a crack, a sliver of blackness opening into the gloom. I have hidden myself, Amaterasu called out from the crack, her voice echoing over the laughter. And surely the central land of reed plains is in darkness. Why then does Amano Uzume dance? And why do all the 800 myriad deities laugh? Uzume, breathless from her dance, stopped and looked at the crack in the stone. She smiled, a cunning, brilliant smile. We rejoice and dance, Uzume replied, because there is a deity here more illustrious than you. It was a lie, but a divine one. At that exact moment, Ame no Koyane and Futodama thrust the Sakaki tree forward, positioning the great Yata no Kagami mirror directly in front of the crack. Amaterasu looked out. In the darkness, she saw a form in the mirror, a figure of blinding, breathtaking radiance. She did not realize she was looking at her own reflection. She was entranced. Is there truly another sun? She thought. Is there a god greater than I? Bewitched by her own beauty, compelled by the mystery, she stepped forward. She moved slowly out of the cave, trying to get a better look at this new deity. This was the moment. Ame no Tajikarao, the god of strength who had been hiding in the shadows, lunged. He grabbed the hand of the Sun Goddess. His grip was iron. He pulled her bodily out of the cave, dragging the light back into the world. Immediately, Futodama took a shimenawa, a sacred straw rope comprised of bottom-tied straw, and strung it across the entrance of the cave behind her. You may not go back in deeper than this, he proclaimed. The boundary was set. The retreat was cut off. As Amaterasu stood fully revealed, the light exploded across the universe. The dark purple clouds vanished. The ice on the rice fields melted. The colors returned to the flowers. The buzzing of the evil flies ceased. burned away by the purifying rays of the sun. The faces of the gods, previously hidden in shadow, were illuminated in relief and joy. Order was restored. The gamble had worked. The sun was back. But as the celebrations began, the gaze of the gods turned toward the one who had caused this near apocalypse. The laughter died down. The mirror was lowered. The focus shifted from the savior, Uzume, to the criminal. Susanoo had watched the restoration of the sun from the fringes of the gathering. Perhaps he had felt a flicker of relief that his sister was safe. Perhaps he had even laughed at Uzume's dance. But he knew, with the fatalism of a tragic hero, that the reckoning was coming. The gods convened a high tribunal. This was not like the trial by oath, ukehi, at the river. This was a sentencing. The verdict was unanimous. Susanoo-no-Mikoto, the swift, impetuous male, was guilty of high treason against the cosmic order. The punishment devised was severe, designed not just to hurt him, but to strip him of his status, his power, and his purity. First, they imposed upon him a fine of 1,000 tables of restitutive gifts. He was forced to hand over immense wealth, likely stripping him of any material possessions he claimed in heaven. Next came the physical and ritual degradation. They cut his beard. In the ancient world, the beard was the seat of a man's dignity and virility. To shear it was to cast him as a child or a eunuch, stripping him of his adult status among the gods. But that was not enough. The crime of flaying the horse required a blood price. The gods seized Susanoo, and, according to the Kojiki, they caused the fingernails of his hands and the toenails of his feet to be pulled out. It was a torture of excruciating somatic intimacy. To have the nails ripped out was to be rendered clawless, unable to grasp, unable to fight. It was a symbolic castration of his power as a storm god. He was left bleeding, shorn, and bankrupt. And then, for the second time in his existence, the sentence was pronounced: Kamuyarai, divine expulsion. Begone, the gods commanded. There is no place for you in the high plane of heaven. This time, he did not leap with earth-shaking vigor. He was thrown. Or perhaps he fell, a ragged comet of disgraced divinity, tumbling from the clouds. The descent from heaven to earth is often depicted in mythology as a glorious arrival. For Susanoo, it was a fall. The wind whipped past his shorn face. The clouds he once commanded now seemed to mock him. He plummeted through the layers of the atmosphere, leaving the golden light of Amaterasu behind, heading toward the verdant, messy, mortal world of the central land of reed plains. He was hungry. He was in pain. And despite the punishment, the wildness in his heart had not been tamed. It had merely been cornered. During his descent, or perhaps shortly after landing, as accounts vary, Susanoo encountered the food goddess, Ogetsu Hime, princess of great food. In his wretched state, he begged her for something to eat. Ogetsu Hime, wishing to serve the brother of the sun, prepared a feast. But her method of preparation was organic. From her nose, her mouth, and her rectum, she produced various dainty dishes. She pulled millet, rice, and beans from her orifices, transforming her own bodily essence into food. Susanoo watched this preparation. He was a god who had just been punished for defiling a sacred hall with excrement. Yet, Seeing this goddess produce food from her own body, he was overcome with a hypocritical, violent revulsion. "You are polluting the food!" he screamed, his eyes flashing with the old murderous fire. "You offer me filth to eat!" He drew the 10-span sword that he still carried, or perhaps a new blade, as he had chewed the old one. In a single stroke, he struck Ogetsu Jaime down. The food goddess died, but even in death, she was bountiful. From her head grew silkworms. From her eyes grew rice seeds. From her ears grew millet. From her nose grew red beans. From her genitals grew wheat. From her rectum grew soybeans. Susanoo looked at the corpse that was blooming into a harvest. He did not mourn her. He did not harvest the crops. That task would fall to Kamimusubi, a separate deity. He simply wiped his blade and turned away. He was a destroyer, not a farmer. He had killed the source of food because it disgusted him. It was a stark reminder that, though he had fallen from heaven, he had not yet learned humility. He was still the storm, violent and reactive. He continued his descent, falling further, until his feet finally touched the solid earth. Susanoo landed at a specific place, etched forever into the sacred geography of Japan. He descended to the peak of Mount Torifun, which stands by the upper reaches of the river Hai-Kawa, in the land of Izumo. Izumo, the name means issuing clouds. It was a land of shadows, of mists, of deep spiritual resonance. It was the antithesis of the bright, dry high plain of heaven. Here, the moss was thick and damp. The cedar trees were ancient and gnarled. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. Susanoo stood on the riverbank. His fingernails were still raw and healing. His beard was gone. He was a ragged wanderer in a strange land, but as he breathed in the air of Izumo, he felt a strange affinity. This was not the sterile order of the sky. This was a place of roots and water. It felt like home. He walked along the banks of the high river. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth gray stones. As he walked, his sharp eyes caught something drifting in the current. It was a pair of chopsticks. To a mortal eye, it might have been driftwood, but to Susanoo, it was a sign. The chopsticks were carved. They implied civilization. They implied a meal. People live upstream, Susanoo deduced. And if there are chopsticks, there is a household. Driven by curiosity, and perhaps the eternal hunger of the exile, he began to trek upstream. The path grew wilder, the forest canopies denser, the roar of the river grew louder. After some time he heard a sound that cut through the noise of the water. It was a sound he knew intimately. It was the sound of weeping. But unlike his own cosmic wailing that had withered the mountains, this was the quiet, desperate sobbing of mortals who have lost all hope. Susanoo pushed through the bamboo thickets and entered a small clearing. There, sitting by the river, was a tragic tableau. An old man and an old woman sat on the mossy ground, hugging a young girl between them. They were caressing her, stroking her hair, and weeping as if she were already dead. The old man was Ashinazuchi, foot-stroking elder. The old woman was Tenazuchi, hand-stroking elder. Both were children of the great mountain deity, Oyamatsumi. They were earthly kami, guardians of this remote region. The girl between them was of breathtaking beauty. She was delicate, like a rice stalk bending in the breeze. Her name was Kusanagi, princess of the wondrous rice field. Susanoo approached them. His shadow fell over the grieving family. He must have looked terrifying, a giant stranger with wild eyes and a sword at his hip. "I am Susanoo," he announced, his voice retaining the imperious tone of heaven. "I have descended from the high plane of heaven. Who are you, and why do you weep?" The old man, Ashinazuchi, looked up. Upon hearing that this stranger was the brother of the Sun Goddess, he wiped his tears and bowed low, a glimmer of awe replacing his despair. "O deign to ask," the old man said, his voice trembling. "I am an earthly deity. This is my wife, and this is my daughter. We weep because the time has come." "The time for what?" Susanoo asked. "For the sacrifice," Ashinazuchi whispered, casting a fearful glance toward the dark mountains upstream. "I once had 8 daughters, but every year, at this time, the 8-forked serpent comes from the land of Koshi. It has eaten my daughters, one by one, year after year. Now, only this one, Kusanagi, remains, and tonight is the night the serpent comes for her." Susanoo felt a stir in his chest. It was not the destructive urge that had led him to flay the horse. It was something new. He looked at the weeping girl, Kusanagi. He saw her fragility, and he looked at the terror in the eyes of her parents. For the first time in his existence, the destructive power of the storm found a target that wasn't an innocent rice field or a sacred weaver. "Tell me," Susanoo said, leaning in, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "What is the form of this serpent?" Ashinazuchi shuddered. "Its eyes are like red winter cherries," he described, his voice hollow with horror. "It has one body with 8 heads and 8 tails. Moss, cypress, and cedar trees grow upon its back. Its length extends over 8 valleys and 8 hills. Its belly is always bloody and inflamed." Yamata-no-Orochi, the 8-forked great serpent. It was a monster of chaos, a creature that embodied the destructive floods of the river itself. It was nature gone wrong, just as Susanoo had been a god gone wrong. Susanoo looked at the girl again. A plan began to form in his mind, a plan that required not just brute strength, but the cunning of a trickster. "If I save this girl," Susanoo said, a wolfish grin spreading across his face, "will you give her to me as my wife?" Ashinazuchi hesitated only for a moment. He looked at the god, then at the doom awaiting his daughter. "With reverence," the old man said, "we will offer her to you." Susanoo nodded. He turned to face the river, listening for the distant rumble of the approaching beast. The weeping god was gone. The rampaging god was gone. The hero had arrived. The pact was made. Susanoo-no-Mikoto, the exile of heaven, stood committed to saving the last daughter of the earthly guardians. But the Yamata-no-Orochi was not a foe that could be defeated by simple swordplay. It was a creature of immense mass and supernatural vitality, a moving mountain range of flesh and fury. To fight it directly would be to invite destruction. Susanoo, for all his impetuousness, possessed the cunning of the storm, the ability to be calm before the strike. He looked at the trembling girl. Kusanada Hime. She was brave, standing there in her simple robes, but she was mortal and fragile. She could not be left on the riverbank while he fought, nor could she run, for the serpent's reach extended over 8 valleys. "Come here," Susanoo said softly. Kusanada Hime stepped forward. Susanoo raised his hands, glowing with the transformative magic of the kami. In a moment of divine intimacy, he changed her form. The girl's body dissolved into light and reshaped itself into a small, exquisite object. A close-toothed comb, Yutsutsuma Gushi. It was a brilliant solution. By turning her into a comb, he could keep her close to him, literally wearing her in his hair, ensuring her safety while freeing his hands for battle. He took the comb and placed it firmly into the knot of his hair, the very hair that had once been wild and is now beginning to regrow. She was safe, nestled against the scalp of a god. Now, he turned to the old parents, Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi. They were staring at him, bewildered by the disappearance of their daughter into his hair. "Do not fear," Susanoo commanded. "She is with me. Now, listen closely. We must prepare the ground. You cannot fight a flood with a stick. You must build a dam, and we shall build a dam of wood and wine." He issued specific architectural instructions. "Build a fence," he ordered, "but not just a simple barrier. It must be an 8-fold fence, yahegaki. It must surround the house completely, with 8 distinct gates." The old couple hurried to obey. They gathered bamboo and cedar, constructing a complex fortification around their home. The fence was designed not to keep the serpent out entirely, but to channel its movement, to control its approach. "At each of the 8 gates," Susanoo continued, "construct a platform. On each platform, place a vat, and into each vat you must pour the liquid I shall describe." This was the key to the strategy. Susanoo did not ask for water or poison. He asked for sake, but not ordinary rice wine. "Brew an 8-fold refined liquor, yashiori no sake," he instructed. Ordinary sake is brewed once. To brew it 8 times meant repeating the fermentation process over and over, concentrating the alcohol content until it was a potent, thick, and overwhelmingly fragrant spirit. It was a distillation of divine intoxication. Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi worked feverishly. They mashed the rice, they mixed the koji mold, and they let the mixture ferment. They repeated the process, refining the liquid until the air around the house grew heavy with the sweet, sharp scent of alcohol. It was a smell that could dizzy a bird in flight. They filled the 8 vats, huge wooden tubs, and placed them on the 8 platforms at the 8 gates of the fence. The trap was set. The sun began to set over the mountains of Izumo. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the river high like dark fingers. The air grew cold and still. The birds stopped singing. The wind died down. Susanoo stood in the center of the 8-fold fence. He checked the comb in his hair. He checked the 10-span sword, Totsuka no Tsurugi, at his waist. He did not pace. He stood like a stone, waiting for the mountain to move. Night fell, and with the darkness came the monster. It did not arrive with a roar, but with a physical sensation. The earth began to vibrate. Pebbles on the riverbank danced. The water in the vats rippled. A smell preceded it, a stench of old blood, rotting vegetation, and the sulphurous odor of deep earth. Then, over the peaks of the surrounding hills, it appeared. Yamata-no-Orochi was unlike any beast in Western mythology. It was a force of corrupted nature. Its 8 heads writhed independently, their eyes glowing like winter cherries. Ake Kagachi, a piercing, bioluminescent red that cut through the night fog. Its body was a landscape in itself. Moss and cypress trees grew upon its scales, rooting into its flesh. As it moved, it dragged the ecosystem with it, a crawling forest of death. It slid down the valley, its massive bulk filling the riverbed of the Hai. The water was displaced, flooding the banks. Susanoo watched from the shadows of the fence. He saw the 8 heads lift, sniffing the air. The serpent had come for flesh, for the tender sacrifice of the maiden. But the scent of the girl was masked by something else, the overpowering, sweet aroma of the 8-fold refined sake. The serpent paused. Snakes are creatures of instinct, and in Japanese folklore, they have a weakness for sake. The aroma was irresistible. Slowly, cautiously, the 8 heads lowered. They found the 8 gates of the fence. They found the 8 vats. Delicious, the beast seemed to think, its predatory focus shifting from hunger to thirst. One by one, the heads dipped into the vats. The great forked tongues lapped up the liquid. Then, the heads submerged completely, drinking greedily. The sound of their drinking was like the draining of a lake, a loud, rhythmic slup, slup, slup. Susanoo waited. He waited as the level of the sake dropped. He waited as the red eyes of the serpent began to glaze over. He waited as the writhing of the necks slowed. The alcohol, potent enough to knock out a god, worked its magic on the beast. The heads became heavy. They slumped onto the platforms. The massive body relaxed, the trees on its back ceasing their swaying. A deep rumble of a snore began to emanate from the creature, shaking the leaves of the bamboo fence. Yamata-no-Orochi was asleep, drunk and defenseless. Susanoo drew his sword. The sound of the steel leaving the scabbard was a sharp whisper in the night. Now, he breathed. He vaulted over the fence. He did not attack with honor. This was an execution. He moved with the speed of the storm wind. He approached the sleeping necks. He raised the 10-span sword and brought it down. The blade bit through scales, muscle, and bone. A fountain of black blood erupted, spraying into the air. Susanoo did not stop. He moved to the next neck. Slash, and the next. The serpent jerked in its sleep, but it was too intoxicated to mount a defense. Susanoo danced among the heads, a whirlwind of steel. He severed all 8 heads. Then he turned his attention to the tails. The river, Hai, turned red. The text says it changed into a river of blood. The sheer volume of gore was staggering, flowing downstream to the sea, announcing to the world that the monster of Koshi was dead. Susanoo was covered in blood. He was hacking at the middle tail when suddenly his sword struck something hard inside the serpent's flesh. It was not bone. It was harder than bone. The edge of his divine 10-span sword chipped. Susanoo stopped, frowning. He looked at his damaged blade. What could be inside a serpent that was harder than the sword of a god? Curious, he used the point of his blade to slice open the flesh of the tail. He peeled back the scales and the muscle. There, embedded in the tail of the monster, was a light, a cold, white steel light. It was a sword. He pulled it out. It was magnificent. It was not a sword forged by hands. It was a sword grown from the marrow of the earth, tempered in the blood of the monster. It hummed with a power that made the air around it tremble. This was the Ame-no-Murakumo-no-Tsurugi, the sword of the gathering clouds of heaven. Later, it would be known as Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword. Susanoo held it up. The clouds above him swirled in response to the blade. He realized instantly that this was no ordinary weapon. This was a regalia, a treasure too great for him to keep. And in this moment, Susanoo showed his growth. The old Susanoo would have kept the sword to conquer the world. The new Susanoo, the hero who had saved the girl, understood propriety. "This is a divine thing," he murmured. "I cannot keep it for my own private use." He decided then and there to send the sword up to the high plane of heaven. He would offer it to his sister, Amaterasu, as a peace offering. It was the ultimate apology, a sword of chaos converted into a symbol of imperial protection. And indeed, this sword remains one of the 3 sacred treasures of the Imperial House of Japan to this day. With the monster dead and the treasure found, Susanoo turned back to the fence. He plucked the comb from his hair. "Kushinada-hime," he whispered. He transformed her back. The girl stood before him, safe, whole, and looking at her savior with eyes full of gratitude and love. The battle was over. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a new, quiet sense of purpose. Susanoo was no longer the wandering exile. He was a husband. He had a wife to care for. "We need a home," he said to Kushinada-hime. "Not a fence of war, but a palace of peace." They left the bloody banks of the high river. They traveled through the land of Izumo, seeking a place suitable for their new life. They came to a place called Shuga. As they arrived, Susanoo looked up. The sky was clearing. Beautiful, billowing clouds were rising from the earth, stacking upon one another in layers of white and gold. It was a peaceful storm, a protective weather front. Susanoo felt a lightness in his heart that he had never felt before. "My heart is refreshed," he declared. "I feel Shuga, Shuga, Shi." Refreshed, pure. And so the place was named Shuga, inspired by the beauty of the clouds and the safety of his new bride. Susanoo felt words rising in his throat. He was the god of storms, yes, but storms are also the breath of the world, and breath is the medium of poetry. He looked at the clouds building a wall around his new home, mirroring the 8-fold fence he had built to save her. He opened his mouth and spoke the first waka poem in the history of Japan, the 31-syllable verse that would become the foundation of Japanese literature. Yakumo Tatsu. The 8-fold clouds rise. Izumo Yagaki. Building an 8-fold fence in Izumo. Tsuma Gomi ni. To embrace and house my wife. Yagaki Tsukuru. I build an 8-fold fence. Sono Yagaki wo. Oh, that 8-fold fence. It was a simple poem, but it was profound. It celebrated protection, domesticity, and the beauty of nature. The 8-fold fence was no longer a trap for a monster. It was a sanctuary for love. The destroyer had become the creator. The screamer had become the poet. Susanoo built his palace there in Shuga. He appointed his father-in-law, Ashinazuchi, as the caretaker of the palace, giving him the title Inada no Miyanushi Shuga no Yatsumimi no Kami, the deity of 8 years of Shuga, master of the palace. There, in the peace of Izumo, Susanoo and Kusanagi Hime lived. They consummated their marriage, and from their union, a lineage of earthly deities was born. Their son was named Yashimajinumi no Kami. This lineage would grow. It would branch out, leading eventually to Okuninushi no Kami, the great landmaster, who would go on to complete the shaping of the land of Japan. Susanoo sat at the head of this genealogy, the fierce patriarch who watched over the Izumo clan. But Susanoo's story does not end in a rocking chair. He was immortal, and his nature was multifaceted. He had conquered the surface world, but the pull of the underworld, the yearning for his mother's land that had started this whole journey, still lingered in his soul. He had established his family. Now he felt the call of the shadows again. He would eventually leave the palace of Shuga to descend into Ne-no-Katasu-Kuni, the land of roots, not as a weeping child this time, but as its ruler. He would become the Great Ancestor god, So-no-Kami, the fierce guardian of the underworld who tests heroes. And it is there, in the dark halls of the underworld, that we will meet him next, not as the protagonist, but as the terrifying father-in-law, waiting for the next young hero to wander into his domain. Generations pass like the turning of autumn leaves in the central land of reed plains. The hero, Susanoo, who slew the serpent and composed the first poem, eventually withdrew from the surface world. Having established his lineage in Izumo, he felt the old pull of the depths returning, the gravity of the earth calling him back to the source. He descended fully into Ne-no-Katasu-Kuni, the land of roots, a realm distinct from the Yomi of the dead, yet sharing its heavy, subterranean atmosphere. Here, he built a new palace, not of bright cypress wood, but of dark, petrified timber and stone. He became the Takehaya Susanoo-no-Mikoto of the underworld, a figure of immense authority, brooding wisdom, and terrifying power. In this twilight realm, Susanoo was no longer the wandering exile. He was the great deity, Ukami. He sat upon a throne of rock, surrounded by the creeping creatures of the deep, his wild hair turning the color of iron, his eyes glowing with the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. He waited. He knew that eventually his bloodline would produce someone worthy to challenge him, someone who could inherit the stewardship of the physical world. That challenger arrived in the form of a young, beleaguered god named Onamuji, the great name possessor. Though he carried a great name, Onamuji was a figure of pity. He was a descendant of Susanoo, typically cited as the 6th generation, but he was persecuted relentlessly by his 80 jealous brothers, the Yasogami. They had tried to kill him with a burning rock disguised as a boar. They had crushed him in the cleft of a tree. Each time, he had been revived by the intervention of his mother and the heavenly gods, but he was weary. Seeking refuge from his murderous kin, Onamuji was advised to seek out the Great Ancestor in the land of roots. "Go to Susanoo," he was told. "He will counsel you." Onamuji's descent was a journey into the subconscious of the world. The air grew thick and humid. The light faded to a perpetual indigo gloom. When he finally arrived at the gates of Susanoo's dwelling, he did not meet the storm god immediately. Instead, he met destiny in the form of a woman. Suseri Bime, princess of the forward impulse, the daughter of Susanoo, came out of the palace. She saw the young god standing at the threshold, weary but beautiful in his suffering. It was a moment of divine recognition. They looked at each other and exchanged glances of longing. In the shadows of the underworld, love bloomed instantly. They married there at the gate, binding their souls before announcing their presence. But a marriage in the house of the storm god is not valid without the father's blessing, and Susanoo was not a father who gave blessings easily. Suseri Bime went inside to announce the visitor. "A very beautiful deity has come," she told her father. Susanoo rose from his seat. He walked to the entrance, his footsteps heavy enough to shake dust from the ceiling. He looked at Onamuji. He did not see a beautiful deity. He saw a soft, untested boy who had spent his life running from bullies. He sneered. The sound was like grinding tectonic plates. "This," Susanoo rumbled, pointing a thick finger at his descendant, "is merely the ugly male of the reed plains, Ashihara Shiku." It was an insult designed to crush the ego. By calling him ugly male, Shiku implies strength, but also roughness or unpleasantness, used here derisively. Susanoo was denying Onamuji's divinity. "You are just a piece of surface trash," he was saying. "But since you are here, you may sleep in the snake chamber." The trials of Susanoo are among the most famous initiation rites in Japanese mythology. They follow a classic shamanic pattern. The initiate is subjected to death, dismemberment, or terror, and survives through the aid of a spirit helper, Suseri Bime, and magical tools. For the first night, Susanoo threw Onamuji into a room filled with vipers. In the land of roots, these were not ordinary snakes. They were writhing, hissing manifestations of the underworld's malice. The floor was a carpet of scales. Their eyes glowed with hunger. To sleep, there was to be bitten 1,000 times. But Suseri Bime, the daughter of the storm, knew her father's cruelty. Before the door was sealed, she slipped a magical object into her husband's hand. It was a hire, a sacred scarf or veil. In Shinto, the hire has the power to repel evil and shake off negative energy. "When the snakes are about to bite you," she whispered, "wave this scarf 3 times and say, 'Be quiet, be still.' The snakes will be pacified." Onamuji stood in the darkness. The hissing rose around him. He felt the cold, dry slide of serpentine bodies over his feet. Terror gripped his heart. But he remembered the scarf. He waved it. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The magic was potent. The snakes, sensing the power of the storm god's daughter in the fabric, recoiled. They settled down, coiling upon themselves, transforming from predators into a harmless, undulating mattress. Onamuji slept peacefully upon the bed of snakes. The next morning, Susanoo opened the door, expecting to find a corpse swollen with venom. Instead, he found Onamuji stretching and yawning, unharmed. Susanoo's eyes narrowed. He was not impressed. He was annoyed. "He survived," the old god grunted. Very well. Tonight, put him in the chamber of centipedes and wasps. The second night was worse. The centipedes, mukade, of Japanese myth, are symbols of pollution and death, associated with mining and darkness. The wasps, hachi, represented stinging pain. The room buzzed and clicked with the sound of 1,000,000 legs and wings. Again, Suseribaime appeared with a second scarf. "This is the scarf to repel centipedes and wasps," she said. "Wave it 3 times. Onamuji obeyed. The scarf beat the air, creating a barrier of spiritual pressure. The insects fell silent. The centipedes retreated into the cracks of the walls. The wasps settled on the ceiling. Once again, the young hero slept soundly amidst the swarm. When Susanoo opened the door the next morning, his annoyance turned into a grudging curiosity. The boy had spiritual protection, but could he survive the elements? Could he survive fire? Susanoo led Onamuji out of the palace, into a vast, dry moor in the underworld. The grass was tall and brittle, like straw. Susanoo took out a great bow. He fitted a narikabura, a humming bulb arrow, to the string. This arrow had a hollow tip made of deer antler or wood, designed to make a loud whistling sound as it flew. It was used in war to signal the start of battle, and in ritual to banish evil spirits. Susanoo drew the bow with his immense strength and loosed the arrow. Whirr! The sound shrieked across the dark sky, disappearing miles away into the tall grass. "Go!" Susanoo commanded. "Fetch the arrow." Onamuji, obedient to the elder, ran into the field. He searched through the grass, pushing deeper and deeper into the wilderness. When Susanoo saw that the boy was deep in the middle of the moor, he enacted his trap. He struck a flint. He lit the grass on fire. In the land of roots, fire burns with a supernatural heat. The flames encircled the field instantly. A ring of fire closed in on Onamuji. He turned to run back, but the wall of flame was impassable. He turned forward, but the fire was racing toward him. He was trapped in a shrinking circle of inferno. He stood frozen, coughing in the smoke, preparing to die. He had survived snakes and insects, but fire consumes all. Suddenly, near his feet, a small voice spoke. "The inside is hollow, hollow. The outside is narrow, narrow. Uchi wa hora hora, tu wa subo subo." Onamuji looked down. A field mouse, Nezumi, was tugging at his hem. The mouse repeated the cryptic rhyme. "The inside is hollow, hollow." Understanding flashed in Onamuji's mind. He stomped his foot exactly where the mouse was standing. The earth gave way. It was the roof of a hollow underground pit, a mouse hole. Onamuji dropped into the hole. The mouse skittered aside. He curled up in the cool earth, huddled beneath the surface. Above him, the fire roared. The heat was intense, sucking the oxygen from the air. The sound was like a freight train passing overhead. But the flames swept over the hole without entering. The fire burned the grass to ash and moved on. When the crackling subsided, Onamuji climbed out. He was covered in soot, but unburned. And there, in the mouth of the mouse, was the humming bulb arrow. The mouse had retrieved it. The feathers of the arrow had been chewed off by the mouse's children, a detail explaining why the arrow looked tattered. But the shaft was intact. Susanoo walked through the smoking ruins of the field, expecting to find a charred skeleton. Instead, he saw Onamuji walking toward him out of the smoke, holding the arrow. This time, Susanoo did not scowl. He looked at the boy with something resembling respect. The boy had the favor of the earth itself. The creatures of the ground protected him. "Come inside," Susanoo said, his voice calmer. "You will wash my hair." The final trial was the most intimate and the most dangerous. In ancient Japan, grooming someone's hair was an act of submission and service. Susanoo led Onamuji into the great hall of the palace. The old god sat down and undid his hair. "My head itches," Susanoo grumbled. "Pick the lice." Onamuji moved closer to look at the great deity's scalp. He recoiled in horror. Crawling through the thick, iron-gray forests of Susanoo's hair were not lice. They were centipedes. Great, venomous centipedes, winding around the follicles, biting at the skin. To touch them was death. To refuse was death. Suseribaime, watching from the shadows, saw her husband's dilemma. She approached silently, holding a tray. On the tray were red clay, red earth, and walnuts, mukabami. "Chew these," she signaled to him. Onamuji understood the ruse. He put the red clay and the walnuts into his mouth. He chewed them into a paste. Then he spat the red mixture out onto the floor beside Susanoo. Susanoo, eyes closed, heard the crunching sound of the walnuts. He saw the red splatter on the floor out of the corner of his eye. "Ah," Susanoo thought, "the lovely fellow is chewing up the centipedes and spitting them out. He is truly a devoted son-in-law." Lulled by the rhythmic grooming and the belief that his parasites were being destroyed, the fierce god began to relax. The tension left his massive shoulders. His breathing deepened. Susanoo fell asleep. But when a storm god sleeps, he does not merely doze. His snores were like thunder. The Kojiki says his snoring caused the rafters of the palace to shake. The sound reverberated through the underworld. This was the chance. Onamuji moved quickly. He knew he could not simply run. Susanoo would wake and catch him. He needed to disable the god. He took Susanoo's long hair that reached the floor, and tied it to the heavy rafters of the palace. He knotted the divine strands securely to the beams of the house. Next, he blocked the door of the palace with a massive boulder, one that would take 500 men to lift. Then, he turned to the treasures of the Underworld. Susanoo possessed artifacts of immense power, the tools necessary to rule a kingdom. Onamuji took them all. 1. The life-saving sword, Ikutachi. 2. The life-saving bow and arrows, Iku-yumi-ya. 3. The heavenly speaking koto, Ame-no-Norigoto, a divine harp. With the wife, Suseribime, on his back and the treasures in his hands, Onamuji fled. He ran toward the exit of the underworld, the Yomotsu Hirasaka. But as they ran, the heavenly speaking koto brushed against a tree. The sound of the divine instrument was clear and resonant. It echoed through the silent underworld. It was an alarm. Susanoo's eyes snapped open. He roared and tried to jump up, but his hair was tied to the rafters. As Susanoo lunged, he didn't just pull his hair, he pulled the entire palace down. The beams splintered. The roof collapsed. The sheer physical strength of the god destroyed his own home as he struggled to untangle his hair. This chaotic destruction bought Onamuji precious time. While Susanoo was disentangling himself from the ruins of his house and his own hair, the young couple raced for the slope leading to the upper world. Susanoo finally freed himself. He chased them. He ran to the Yomotsu Hirasaka, the boundary between the living and the dead. He looked up. Onamuji and Susuri Baime were already far up the slope, nearly at the surface. Susanoo stopped. He did not cross the boundary. Instead of throwing a curse or a spear or a lightning bolt, the great god Susanoo did something unexpected. He shouted. His voice boomed from the depths of the earth, carrying not rage, but a fierce, triumphant authorization. "With that life-saving sword and life-saving bow that you hold," Susanoo bellowed, "chase your half-siblings into the slopes of the hills, chase them into the currents of the rivers, and you, fellow, become the great master of the land, Okuninushi. Become the spirit of the living land. Utsushi Kuni Dama." He paused, then added a final domestic command for his daughter's sake. "Make my daughter Susuri Bime your chief wife. Build a palace at the foot of Mount Uka. Build its pillars deep into the bedrock, and raise its crossbeams to the high plane of heaven. And dwell there, you rascal, Ureotoko." It was the ultimate blessing. Susanoo had not been trying to kill Onamuji. He had been forging him. By surviving the snakes, the insects, and the fire, and by having the cunning to steal the treasures and the audacity to tie up a god, Onamuji had proven himself worthy. He was no longer the ugly male. He was Okuninushi, the master of the great land. Susanoo stood at the gate of the Underworld, watching them disappear into the light. He turned back to his ruined palace, alone once more in the dark. The storm god had passed the torch. His work as an ancestor was done. He had created the king who would build Japan. The mythological timeline of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki eventually moves past Susanoo. His son-in-law, Okuninushi, completes the great work of building the land, only to eventually surrender it to the descendants of Amaterasu in the heavenly descent, Tensen Korin. Susanoo, brooding in the underworld or residing in his shrines, seems to vanish from the central political narrative. However, a god as vibrant as the storm does not simply fade into obscurity. He evolves. In the folklore preserved in the Bingo no Kuni Fudoki, the gazetteer of the province of Bingo, Susanoo reappears not as a cosmic conqueror, but as a ragged traveler, testing the hearts of mortals, much like he tested the heart of the food goddess. Though this time, the lesson is one of hospitality and hygiene. In this legend, Susanoo is traveling through the northern provinces. He is not dressed in divine finery. He wears the straw cloak of a peasant and carries the dust of the road on his skin. Night falls, and a cold rain begins to beat down upon the plains. The god needs shelter. He comes upon two houses standing side by side. One is a grand estate, surrounded by high walls and filled with the light of many lamps. It belongs to Kotan Shorai, a man of immense wealth. The other is a dilapidated hut, barely standing against the wind. It belongs to his older brother, Somen Shorai, a man of abject poverty. Susanoo knocks on the gate of the rich brother Kotan. "I am a traveler from the north," the god calls out, his voice shivering with the damp. "I seek only a dry corner to sleep in for the night." Kotan Shorai opens the gate just a crack. He sees the dirty, disheveled man. He does not see the divine light hidden beneath the grime. He sees only a beggar who might soil his floors or steal his silver. "Be off with you," Kotan sneers. "I have no room for vagrants." He slams the heavy gate shut. Susanoo turns away. He walks to the small, crumbling hut of Somin Shorai. He knocks on the flimsy door. Somin opens it immediately. He sees the suffering of the stranger and does not hesitate. "Please, enter," Somin says. "It is not much, but it is dry." Somin Shorai has almost nothing. He has no silk bedding. He offers the stranger a mat of woven millet straw. He has no white rice or fish. He boils a coarse millet gruel, the only food he has for himself, and gives the larger portion to the guest. He treats the ragged wanderer with the reverence due an emperor. Susanoo eats the millet. He sleeps on the straw, and in the morning, revealing his true nature, or perhaps simply speaking with the weight of divine gratitude, he makes a promise. "You have treated me with a pure heart," Susanoo says. "I am Susanoo-no-Mikoto. Listen well. In the years to come, a terrible pestilence will sweep through this land. People will fall like cut grass, but you and your descendants shall be spared." He instructs Somin to weave a ring out of chigaya, kogon grass. "Wear this ring of grass around your waist," Susanoo commands. "Let it be the mark of your lineage." A few years later, the plague came. It was a virulent, swift death that struck the province. The wealthy household of Kotan Shorai was decimated. Not a single soul survived the sickness. His walls could not keep out the microscopic demons of disease. But in the hut of Somin Shorai, the family wore the grass rings. The pestilence passed over their house. They were untouched. This legend is the origin of the Chino-wa ritual, performed in Shinto shrines every summer. If you visit a shrine in June, you will see a massive ring of woven grass standing in the courtyard. Worshippers walk through it in a figure-8 pattern to purify themselves of sin and protect themselves from illness. They are reenacting the hospitality of Somin Shorai, invoking the protection of Susanoo against the pestilence of the summer. Here, Susanoo transforms again. He is no longer just the chaotic storm or the hero who kills monsters. He has become the Shinto god of pestilence and medicine. In ancient thought, the god who brings the disease is the only one who can control it. By surviving his anger or appeasing him, one gains immunity. He is the poison and the cure. As Buddhism entered Japan and merged with native Shinto beliefs, a phenomenon called Shinbutsu Shugo, Susanoo underwent a dramatic theological fusion. He became identified with a powerful, somewhat terrifying deity from the mainland. Gozu Tenno, the ox-headed heavenly king. Gozu Tenno was originally a deity associated with the Jetavana monastery in India, Gion Shoja, the protector of the Buddha's sanctuary. But in Japan, he took on the characteristics of the storm god. Like Susanoo, Gozu Tenno was fierce, impulsive, and associated with disease. This syncretism explains the appearance of the famous Yasuka Shrine, formerly Gion Shrine, in Kyoto. This shrine is the headquarters of Susanoo worship in Japan, but for centuries, the deity enshrined there was viewed simultaneously as Susanoo and Gozu Tenno. The imagery is striking. Susanoo, the wild Japanese god, wearing the mask of the ox-headed king, a figure of tremendous esoteric power. This fusion solidified his role as the guardian against epidemics. The logic was simple. If you want to stop a plague, you do not pray to a gentle god. You pray to the biggest, scariest boss of the demons. You pray to Susanoo Gozu Tenno, asking him to call off his minions. This belief system reached its zenith in the year 869 A.D. The summer of 869 A.D. in Kyoto, then Heian-kyo, was a season of horror. The capital was ravaged by a plague so severe that the streets were lined with corpses. The government was paralyzed. The doctors were helpless. The people believed that the epidemic was caused by Goryo, vengeful spirits of the dead, angry at political injustices, who were poisoning the air. To quell this spiritual rebellion, the emperor ordered a massive ritual, the Goryo-ua, Assembly of Vengeful Spirits. They erected 66 halberds, hoko, one for each province of ancient Japan, in the Shinsen-en Garden. They summoned the spirit of Susanoo as Gozu Tenno from the Gion Shrine. They placed the mikoshi, portable shrines, on the streets and marched them through the city. The idea was to physically parade the god of storms through the infected city. His presence would scour the streets, frightening away the plague spirits and absorbing the miasma of sickness. This ritual worked, or at least the plague subsided as autumn came. The people were so relieved, and the spectacle was so magnificent, that they repeated it. Over centuries, this grim purification ritual evolved into the Gion Matsuri, which is today the most famous and spectacular festival in Japan. If you go to Kyoto in July, you witness the legacy of Susanoo in its most opulent form. The Yamaboko Junko, procession of floats, features massive wooden floats, some weighing 12 tons, towering 25 meters high. They are draped in priceless tapestries, Nishijin ori, and carpets from Persia and Europe. Musicians sit atop them, playing the Gion Bayashi, a hypnotic, rhythmic music of flutes, drums, and bells. Konchiki-chin, konchiki-chin, asterisk. But at the heart of this gold and glitter is the core purpose: purification. The floats are essentially giant spiritual vacuum cleaners. As they move through the streets, they suck up the misfortunes, the sins, and the potential diseases of the populace. And leading this procession, spiritually, if not physically, is Susanoo. He is the rough energy that makes the purification possible. The festival is a thunderstorm of culture, loud, overwhelming, and cleansing. It is the perfect tribute to a god who began his life by shaking the mountains and ended it by saving the people. As we look back at the complete life of Takehaya Susanoo-no-Mikoto, from the nose of Izanagi to the streets of modern Kyoto, we see a trajectory unlike any other deity in the pantheon. Amaterasu is consistent. She is the sun, the order, the imperial ancestor. She is distant and perfect. Tsukuyomi is consistent. He is the shadow, the silent observer. But Susanoo is a mess, and that is why he is beloved. He begins as an infant who refuses to do his job, crying until he destroys the ecosystem. He is a brat. He becomes a vandal, destroying rice fields and defiling temples out of spite, and a desperate need for attention. He is a criminal. He becomes an exile, stripped of his dignity, wandering the earth hungry and alone. He is an outcast. He becomes a hero, using his wits to defeat a dragon and saving a vulnerable girl. He is a savior. He becomes a poet, finding beauty in the clouds and establishing the culture of words. He is an artist. He becomes a terrifying father-in-law, putting the next generation through hell to toughen them up. He is a mentor. And finally, he becomes a guardian spirit, walking through the rain to test our hospitality, and standing at the gates of our cities to hold back the plague. He encompasses the entire spectrum of the human experience. He represents the Ara Mitama, the rough spirit that dwells within us all, the part of us that wants to scream, to break things, to run away. But he also shows us that this same energy, when disciplined and directed by love, as with Kusanagi Hime, can kill monsters and build civilizations. The storm does not hate the earth. It shakes it. It washes it. It breaks the dead branches so that new growth can emerge. Today, when you stand before the Izumo Taisha shrine, with its massive Shimenawa rope, the thickest in Japan, hanging like a heavy cloud over the sanctuary, you are standing in the shadow of Okuninushi, but also in the echo of Susanoo. And if you travel to the Yasaka Shrine in Kyoto, ring the bell and bow twice, clap twice, and bow once. You are greeting the boy who cried the rivers dry. You are greeting the exile who found a sword in a tale. You are greeting the storm god who finally found peace, not by suppressing his nature, but by using his wildness to protect the fragile, beautiful world of the reed plains. The wind blows through the cryptomeria trees. The rain begins to fall, washing the dust from the torii gates. It is not a mournful sound anymore. It is the breathing of Susanoo, watching over the land he once terrified, and now eternally loves. Thank you for journeying with me from the high plain of heaven to the shadow of the underworld, from the banks of the rushing river to the sanctuary of the eightfold fence. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete life of Susanoo, and if you found peace in the sound of the falling rain, please leave a like and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. May your own defenses be strong. May your heart always feel refreshed. And may you find shelter from every storm that comes your way. Sleep well.